In March 1959, an ambitious young caver ventured into the shadowy depths of Peak Cavern in Derbyshire, England, eager to explore a newly discovered shaft. But what began as an exciting descent into the unknown quickly turned into a tragic struggle for survival, as he found himself trapped deep within the cave's unforgiving walls. Despite an intense rescue effort that captured the nation's attention, the earth ultimately held him tight, refusing to let go. On March 22, 1959, a young Oxford undergraduate named Oscar Neil Moss embarked on an expedition to Peak Cavern, a vast and unwinding cave system set within the rugged landscape of Derbyshire, England. Known locally as the Devil's Arse due to its thunderous echoes when flooded, Peak Cavern is famous for its foreboding passageways and claustrophobic chambers. But Moss was no amateur. He was a philosophy student from Balliol College and a member of the British Speleological Association. His tall, slender frame stood out among his fellow cavers, often bending to maneuver through narrow passages. Yet he was no stranger to the twists and turns that lay ahead. At just 20 years old, Neil Moss was already respected in caving circles for his curiosity and resolve. He had a serious but gentle presence and a mind hungry for exploration. Despite his towering height of over 6 foot 2 inches, which made some aspects of caving more challenging, his spirit and intellect were unrestrained by the limitations of his physical form. Driven by a desire to push the boundaries of the known world, Moss was eager to be a part of the small expedition venturing deep into the caves. This expedition was no ordinary trip. It was a chance to reach a newly discovered shaft found only weeks before. A thrilling mystery of uncharted territory lay before them. Neil's team that day consisted of 8 individuals, including 4 experienced cavers who had stumbled upon the shaft just 2 weeks prior. They brought the best equipment of the time: sturdy helmets, lamps to light the shadows, ropes to steady their descent, and a daunting 75-foot ladder. The shaft itself lay approximately 1,000 feet from the cave entrance, buried deep in the pitch-black maze of corridors and narrow fissures the Peak Cavern is famous for. There, among the cool, damp walls of stone, the team prepared to venture further into the unknown, beyond the reach of daylight. At around 3:30 p.m., the group began their descent, their lamps casting long shadows against the rough, damp surfaces of the cave walls. Each member carefully followed the familiar routine: ropes tightened, helmets adjusted, and finally, a careful grip on the ladder as they descended, one by one. But in these ancient stone chambers, they would soon face a test of endurance and survival far beyond anything they had prepared for. Neil Moss had no way of knowing that this journey into the heart of Peak Cavern would become one of the most harrowing stories in British caving history, a tragedy that would linger in the dark recesses of this cave, echoing long after he was gone. As the group moved deeper into the cave, their path became narrower and darker still, and each turn held a mystery that waited to be unveiled. But fate had its own plans, lurking just around the corner. The caves of Peak Cavern weren't carved by human hands. They were raw, natural labyrinths shaped over millennia by water and stone. Unlike artificial tunnels with their straight edges and predictable paths, Peak Cavern was a maze of twisted, uneven corridors and gaping chambers, marked by slippery mud and rough, jagged rock formations. It was a place that seemed to test anyone who dared enter, with narrow squeezes and treacherous drops that defied logic. One misstep could lead a caver down the wrong path, potentially trapping them in a confined crevice, with the cold weight of the earth pressing in on all sides. It was this inhospitable environment that Neil Moss and his team were preparing to descend into, an uncharted shaft, a dangerous 40-foot drop that held as much mystery as it did risk. The descent into this shaft wasn't smooth or straightforward. It was a brutal series of twists, turns, and steep drops. As Moss carefully navigated the first 12 feet, he found himself facing a tight corkscrew twist in a passage. Here, the walls were rough and narrow, forcing him to angle his body just right to make it through. Every inch required precise movement, with barely enough room to turn his head and see where he was going. Even his slim, tall frame was nearly too large for the contorted path, and his helmet frequently scraped against the rough stone overhead. His breath quickened as he twisted himself through the squeeze, but he kept going, inch by careful inch, determined not to let the rock intimidate him. Beyond the corkscrew twist, Neil moved into a horizontal section, a brief 10-foot reprieve where he could stretch out a bit and gather his breath. The air here was thick, heavy, and damp. Though his lamp lit the immediate path, shadows seemed to cling to the walls, making the space feel tighter than it was. Moss knew the team behind him was waiting, trusting him to scout the way forward. They had come so far, there was no turning back now. Then came the vertical drop, a daunting 18-foot descent deeper into the earth. He steadied himself, gripping the ladder and breathing deeply. With a few careful movements, Neil made his way down, his boots pressing firmly against the rungs. But as he neared the bottom, he encountered something the team hadn't expected, a massive boulder blocking the passage. The shaft hadn't been fully explored, and this obstacle was as much a surprise as it was a serious threat. Moss inspected the boulder, assessing whether it could be moved to clear the way. With a gloved hand, he pushed and tugged, trying to shift the weight of the stone. It barely budged. As he moved, his ladder slipped beneath him, wedging itself against the rock and trapping him in a brutally narrow, 18-inch wide space between the ladder and the boulder. The more he shifted, the tighter the squeeze became. Panic began to creep in as he realized his body was now wedged firmly between the unyielding rock and the metal of the ladder. The cold stone pressed against his chest, making each breath shallow and strained, while the narrow space left no room to adjust. Moss was trapped, fully immobilized in the unforgiving grip of the cave. Back above, the rest of the team waited, unaware of the gravity of Neil's predicament. The darkness around him was absolute, the walls close and unrelenting. For Neil, every minute that passed felt like an eternity. The cave, once a thrilling mystery, had become a merciless prison, and there, deep within Peak Cavern, Neil Moss faced the chilling reality that he was now part of that very rock and shallow he'd come to explore. As word of Neil Moss's entrapment reached the surface, panic quickly spread among the team and soon escalated into a massive rescue effort involving some of the country's most skilled and determined personnel. Initial attempts to free Neil were simple, direct, and brutal. Ropes were lowered to try and pull him out, with rescuers gripping and tugging with all their might, but the confined space and Neil's wedged position worked against them. And to their growing frustration, their ropes began to snap under the strain. With local efforts proving futile, professionals were summoned. Soon, a lineup of experts arrived: the RAF, the Royal Navy, the National Coal Board, and the police. All converged on Peak Cavern to attempt what was quickly becoming a desperate mission. Time was ticking, and each passing hour seemed to draw Neil deeper into the dark, cold heart of the cave. Despite their experience and equipment, the rescuers faced an almost insurmountable challenge. No amount of expertise could change the unyielding dimensions of the rock that held Neil fast. In their search for a solution, rescuers turned to volunteers, hoping a smaller, more slender person might succeed where equipment had failed. But the deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. 3 volunteers ventured into the shaft, each pushing through the narrow, twisting passage to try to reach Neil. But the foul air, thick and oxygen-starved, claimed each of them. One by one, the volunteers lost consciousness in the same cramped, toxic space where Neil was trapped. They were dragged out, barely conscious and visibly shaken by their fellow rescuers. Then came Ron Peters, a seasoned caver with experience in some of the country's most challenging environments. He carefully inched his way down the jagged, muddy shaft, feeling the stale, oppressive air thicken around him as he descended. When he finally reached Neil, he managed to tie a rope securely around Neil's chest, providing a sliver of hope to the team waiting above. But despite all the efforts, Neil's body was too tightly wedged. Pulling him out was an impossible task. The narrow space was unyielding, and the rope proved no match for the mountain of rock confining him. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, another volunteer emerged from the crowd, a young woman named June Bailey. Just 18 years old and a typist by trade, June was not what one would picture as a rescuer, but with nerves of steel, she volunteered to descend into the cold, narrow depths in one final attempt to reach Neil. When she arrived at his side, she tried to reassure him, but the foul air hung heavily in the shaft, thick with a sickening staleness that rendered her own strength and resolve powerless. Despite her courage, she could do little but speak to him softly in those crushingly dark moments before getting pulled back up. The efforts continued into the early hours of the morning, with oxygen tanks lowered into the shaft at 12:30 a.m. Rescue workers hoped the fresh air might clear the toxic gases, buying them precious time. Compressed air cylinders were deployed, pumping what clean air they could into the shaft, but the cave seemed to absorb it, an endless void that swallowed every attempt. The rescuers, undeterred, turned to excavation, aiming to break through the rock below the shaft in a final desperate attempt to free Neil. But as they toiled, heavy rain began to fall, sending torrents of water into the already treacherous cave system. The passage flooded quickly, halting any further attempts and turning the shaft into an impassable trap. Rescuers were forced to retreat, their hopes shattered, their plans exhausted. And as they left Peak Cavern, the solemn realization dawned on them that the earth had claimed Neil Moss as its own.